Behind me is the Mandovi River that meanders and curves its way through Goa into Panjim and eventually into the Arabian Sea. But it is another curve that has gotten me out of bed this morning. Meet the Tata Curvv. We've driven the Curvv before, but that was the EV. This is the ICE. It gets slightly different styling, slightly different interiors, but most importantly, it debuts the new 1.2 Hyperion GDI engine from Tata Motors, and it also gets an updated diesel engine compared to the Nexon. I'm really excited to get behind the wheel and see what these new engines are like. So welcome to Evo India. Welcome to our first drive review of the Tata Curvv. But before we go ahead, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the Evo India channel and leave a comment down below. What do you think of Tata Motors' attempt to take on the likes of the Hyundai Creta, Kia Seltos and all of the other cars in the mid SUV segment? We'd love to know. Let's start by talking about the styling, because what differentiates the Curvv from the rest of the mid SUV segment is its SUV coupe styling. Now, we've seen the Curvv before in the Curvv EV, but what differentiates the ICE from the EV is the front end. The ICE obviously requires a lot more cooling, and you see a lot more vents up front in the grille, down below here, and even in the bumper. You've also got a different design element here. The grille is very reminiscent of the updated Safari and the updated Harrier with these colored elements. You also got an LED light bar up front and the split headlamp design. When you look at the car in profile, you'll notice a couple of things. One, gloss black cladding all around, not matte black. You have 18-inch wheels and it's a pretty cool wheel design. In fact, it actually reminisces what the Urus used to get. This is a little more rounded off in its spokes, but very familiar. The Curvv badging on the flanks over there. You've got flush door handles with LED elements in it, and obviously the pièce de résistance is the curved roofline. So let's head over to the back and check that out. This is the most interesting angle of the Tata Curvv, this raked back roofline. I like how this lighting element curves over the side. It's a really aggressive looking light design, looks very cool. You've got the Curvv badging here, you've got more gloss black elements down below. And something that's really interesting is that there's no conspicuous cutout for the tailpipes. It's hidden down there, so the differentiation between ICE and EV is minor. In terms of dimensions, the Curvv is 4.3 meters long. The wheelbase is stretched over the Nexon 62 mm longer, and the ground clearance is 208 mm. Now, let's head inside the car and see what that's like. Step inside the Curvv, and this is a familiar layout. There are differences compared to the EV, and the most prominent of them is the interior colors. You've got this burgundy, almost oxblood-like interior leatherette coloring, which I must say looks very tastefully done. On the dash, you've got the same leatherette, you've got the color on the steering wheel as well. It's fairly prominent all over the interiors. You've got hard plastics as well, so you've got a hard plastic up here, and you've got these glossy black plastic panels for trim elements in the dash. The overall layout and architecture of the interior is very similar to the EV. So you've got a 10.25-inch instrument cluster, you've got a 12.3-inch infotainment screen. Below that, you've got this digital touch panel for your AC controls. But something that does differentiate it from the EV is this. You've got a manual transmission here. This is the turbo-petrol that we're driving. In terms of features, this is very well loaded. So you've got electrical adjust seats, you've got ventilation up front, you've got this massive panoramic sunroof, you've got JBL sound, you've got the Arcade EV app suite, you've also got a 360-degree camera, wireless CarPlay and Android Auto. So this is a very well loaded car. In terms of spec, really, there's not much you can complain about in here. However, the interiors here are not perfect. For starters, the wheel, it's only adjustable for rake, it's not adjustable for reach. And somehow I feel like this is a carryover from the Nexon, and it is based somewhere on the Nexon platform. Tata Motors claims this is all new, but the interior layout says otherwise. Another thing is the interiors are not as ergonomic as the others in the mid-size SUV. Much like the Nexon, the central tunnel is the same. You've got this wireless phone charger tray here, you've got a really tiny cubby hole here, and even these USB ports are not so easy to access, and if you do access them, it takes away this as storage area. So in terms of simply storage areas, ergonomics around the cabin, it is not as good as the competition. It carries forward the same drawbacks that the Nexon has. And I mean, I'm not a big fan of that. Step into the back seat of the Curvv and there are immediate improvements from the Curvv EV. That's because the floor is lower. You don't have batteries in the floor here. Your feet are sitting lower and that makes this a much more comfortable seating position. I can move my feet a little bit under the front seat. I can make use of the under thigh support over here. So my knees are not in an upright position and the seating position is a lot more comfortable. You've got an armrest in the back with cup holders. So these are the only cup holders in the car. There's no cup holders up front. And the seat back has a two-step recline angle. The seat also is very nicely done, well padded with good lumbar support. That said, you do have a slight hump over here for the transmission tunnel and your armrest is very thin. I've got thin arms and I can just about use the armrest. Somebody with broader arms will find it difficult. In terms of space, it's just about adequate. I have a couple of inches of free knee room with the driver's seat in my position. I'm 5'10", by the way. And in terms of headroom, because of this sloping roofline, again, it's just about adequate. It's enough for me, but anybody taller than me might find it a little uncomfortable over here. Overall, the back seat is nicer than the Curvv EV, but by no means is it a class benchmark for backseat comfort. And the last thing I want to talk about before we get to the driving is boot space. Click this button here and the Curvv's boot opens electrically. In there, you've got 500 liters of storage. It's a fairly cavernous boot and you can flip the rear seats down 60-40 split to expand it up to 973 liters. This is definitely one of the highlights of the Curvv in this segment. You can shut it with a button as well and you've got that kick function where you can kick it to open it if you've got your hands full. Okay, so now behind the wheel of the Tata Curvv, we're starting in the petrol. And it's significant because this is an all new engine from Tata Motors. They're calling it the Hyperion engine. It's a 1.2 litre GDI engine. Before we get to the driving impressions, let me take you indoors and give you a complete walk around of the engine with a cutaway. Now, this is going to get a little technical. So if you don't like technical bits, I suggest just skip ahead to my driving impressions, but this is interesting. So if you like the technical bits, stick around. This is the new Hyperion turbo-petrol engine from Tata Motors, and this is going to be the center of their future turbo-petrol engines. This is a GDI engine, gasoline direct injection, where fuel is injected directly into the cylinder to give better performance and better efficiency. And I'm going to quickly walk you through the technical innovations on this engine. The first thing we need to talk about is this. This is your turbocharger. It's a variable geometry turbocharger from Kyrojet, and what it allows is a wide spread of torque. So peak torque starts as low as 1700 RPM and goes all the way up to 3500 RPM. And the idea behind a VGT is to allow that wide spread of torque where peak torque can come in lower down as well. What you see here, below that is the emission system. So this is a 4-way catalytic converter with a 3-way catalytic converter and a GPF integrated right into it. So this allows this 1.2 engine to meet current but also future emission norms. When you come around to the side, over here you'll notice this. This is an aluminum sump, and the whole idea behind this is to add structural rigidity to the engine. And this is basically for NVH. Instead of allowing the engine to vibrate and then adding stuff on the car to reduce NVH levels, they've tried to eliminate it at the source itself. This allows less vibrations in the engine and basically keeps things quieter and more refined in the engine. Up here, these are your twin cams. The cams are interesting because you also get VCT, variable cam timing, on both intake and exhaust. And this allows them to tune the engine better for whatever the conditions it's dealing with, whether it's altitude or whether it's different inputs from the driver. When you come over to the back, up top over here, this is your fuel pressure pump. The GDI engine operates at a very high pressure, 350 bar, and this pump is what allows the engine to operate at those pressures. So it pressurizes the fuel, pumps it into the engine, and then the injectors spray it into the cylinders. Another innovation is what they've done in terms of longevity of the engine. There's a lot of work that's been done around the pistons to make it last longer. The exhaust valves have sodium cooling, and that is for thermal fatigue, so that when the engine does warm up, it can cool itself faster so that it works better. You've also got, if you look in here, a self-tightening timing chain. So this timing chain is essentially set for life, and you don't need to adjust it over the life of the engine. And if you come around this side, this here is the dual mass flywheel. Now the dual mass flywheel again allows for better NVH, it allows for better, quieter running, and it's on both the manual as well as the DCT. Now I know we've gotten a little technical over here and we don't usually do that, but this engine is packing a fair bit of tech and it's worth talking about before we get to the driving. Right, now that we've understood the technicalities of the engine, what's more important is how it feels. And straight off the bat, I'm going to tell you that this is one of the best engines Tata Motors has ever made. And I'm not even kidding. It's really, really impressive in how it moves. The first thing that stood out to me is the refinement. This is a 3-cylinder. 3 cylinders are inherently gruff and rorty, but not this one. It's really smooth, it's really slick. NVH levels are very well controlled. All of that work that they put into the engine to keep the vibration low has worked. Very little of it filtering into the cabin. In terms of outputs, it makes 123 bhp and 225 Nm of torque. That's peak torque in the sportiest driving mode, but it has an overboost function. So in 4th and 5th gear, once you're past 70% throttle, it will dial up the turbo. The VGT will be cranked up a little bit to put out 250 Nm, so 25 Nm more in overboost. And that's on demand. So as long as those conditions are met, 4th, 5th gear, above 70% throttle, you are getting 250 Nm of torque. The way it picks up speed is very energetic. Honestly, before I sat in this car, I was a little worried whether a 1.2 engine would be enough for a car like the Curvv. It is a larger car than the Nexon, it is a little heavier. But the way they've done this 1.2 GDI engine is really spot on. Okay, it's not going to be able to compete with the likes of the Taygun 1.5 TSI or even the Hyundai GDI engine, the 1.5. Those are larger engines, they have more displacement, they have an extra cylinder. They feel more broad-chested and more effortless and a little snappier in more aggressive picking up the pace as well. But for a 1.2, this is really impressive and it feels adequate for the Curvv. There is a little bit of vibration at the steering wheel when you're in the higher reaches of the power band. So 3,500, 4,000 RPM, you do feel a little vibration at the steering wheel, but it's not super intrusive. And you don't mind it so much. What I like the most is how low the torque curve starts at. You know, at 1700 RPM you have peak torque, and that's really nice. The VGT also reduces lag to a certain degree. So because it has that variable geometry, it can respond differently at lower revs and differently at higher revs, and that makes a huge difference to the sort of tractability that this motor has. I'm genuinely very impressed by this engine, and it's a really, really good effort from Tata Motors. This 1.2 GDI, it comes mated to a manual, which is what I'm driving right now, and also a DCT. The manual, it works as you would expect it to. It's not the slickest of throws, but it's fairly improved from earlier Tata Motors cars. This is a 6-speed, the DCT is a 7-speed, but even with the 6-speed, the ratios are well spaced. You don't find yourself flying out of the power band if you shift too early or anything like that. You've got good closely spaced ratios, and it sort of works well with this engine layout. Now let's get to the ride and handling balance of the Curvv. Ride quality is good. Again, with 18-inch wheels, you'd think it would be a little firm, but it does a good job of ironing out our roads. Occasionally, you will hear a loud sound from the suspension, but I heard that only once, and Goa honestly has reasonably good roads, so we've not tested it on very bad roads yet. At higher speeds as well, it rides really well. It stays planted, it stays stable. Typical Tata Motors attributes, you know, they do know how to do ride and handling very well, and that continues with the Curvv. Despite having 18-inch wheels, it does have fairly large sidewalls, and that does help with cushioning the car a fair bit. But yes, there's no denying that this is not the most plush ride quality in its class. There is a slightly firm edge to it. When you go over slightly sharper bumps, you do feel it a little bit in the cabin. But again, like I said, not very uncomfortable. Handling. Like we said with the Curvv EV, the steering wheel is just a little too big in terms of diameter. I think that robs you of a little bit of feel. Otherwise, the steering wheel is quick. It handles reasonably well. This is a lot lighter than the Curvv EV, and I think that makes it feel a little more nimble on its feet. This steering wheel is a new EPAS system. It's not the hydraulic system that you used to get on Tata Motors cars. What it does do is make it a little easy to drive. The feel, it's very light in terms of its weight, it's slick, it doesn't have too much by way of those vibrations and kickbacks that used to happen earlier. So that's a good thing. It's a nice, well-judged steering wheel, and very similar to what you get on the EV Curvv. But yeah, overall, very impressed by this Curvv EV. Now, before I get to the verdict, we have also driven the diesel engine. So let me just quickly hop into that and show you what that is like. Okay, now we are in the diesel. This is the 1.5 diesel engine. It's basically the same Nexon diesel, but it has some upgrades. So let's head back indoors. I've got another cutout of the diesel engine here, and let's get a quick walkthrough of the updates to the engine. Now, this is the second engine that Tata Motors is offering on the Curvv. This is the new Kyrojet diesel engine, and it essentially started as the Nexon diesel engine, but there have been a lot of innovations to make it far improved compared to the Nexon. Peak power and peak torque remain the same as the Nexon. However, the spread of torque is now much wider, and that has been possible thanks to this. This is the new turbocharger that sits on this engine, and it allows better performance at higher altitudes and better efficiency all around. There have been a number of other innovations on this engine to make it improved over the Nexon. One of them is this. This is the intake. It's a lot shorter than the Nexon's intake, and it's also made of this porous material to reduce the sort of suction noise or the intake noise that happens when the engine is sucking in air. There have been structural changes inside the engine. Again, like the petrol, the whole idea was to reduce NVH at the source, and the block has been reinforced a lot to reduce vibrations when the engine is firing. You've also got a lot of acoustic covering all over the engine. So if you look around here, this rubbery material which sits over the timing chain, you've got it down below over here near the sump, and you've also got some of it up here. And all of this helps reduce NVH and keep it compressed right inside the engine and not allow it to enter the cabin. Now let's head into the car and see what this feels like from behind the wheel. Now what does all that translate to? Let's talk numbers. 116 bhp and 260 Nm of torque. So in terms of performance, it makes about 3 horsepower more than the Nexon. But what's critical is efficiency is a little better, NVH is a little better, and there's a flatter torque curve. So peak torque starts at 1500 RPM. That's a good thing, because as soon as you hit 1500 RPM, you have this surge of torque. Now, Unlike the turbo-petrol, it doesn't rev out as easily. It feels like it's a little more lazy to rev, but that's a typical diesel trait. Also, the redline is not as high. So you do have to shift up a little quicker than you do on the petrol, but it's still a very enjoyable engine. The diesel characteristics still come through. It feels very torquey, very, like it just has that low end grunt which pulls it to higher speeds very effortlessly. The DCT is also new. So now with this diesel engine, you do get a DCT, and it's the only DCT on sale with diesel engines at this price point, which is quite impressive. Does it work well though? I must say it does. That relentlessness of the torque is very much present because the DCT shifts so quickly. You don't have very large interruptions in torque delivery, and that feels very enjoyable when you're just shifting up through the gearboxes. When you say you pull out onto a highway and you step on it and there's an open road in front of you, and the effortlessness with which it climbs through the gears and gets up to cruising speed is really enjoyable. And that's why we love our diesels, because of that feeling of effortlessness. NVH levels, okay, it's not as good as the petrol. You still have a little bit of the diesel rumble. Lower down in the rev band, it's not too audible. It's once you cross 2,500 RPM, then you can hear it a little bit. It's a typical diesel growl, which you can hear very audibly in the cabin. But I must say, it is reasonably well contained at lower revs where people are going to use the car the most. Like on the petrol, you have a sport mode here. Put in a sport mode, and it just makes things a little more energetic, a little more quick. The throttle gets a lot more sensitive, and sometimes that means modulating the throttle at lower speeds is a little tricky. In sport mode, if you're in the city, you might just want to dial it back to city because it's just a lot easier to manage in city mode when it just comes on to boost. But otherwise, it's a very easy engine to drive. Typical diesel characteristics, typical long-legged characteristics. In terms of acceleration, Tata Motors claims 12.5 seconds for this diesel DCT, which is good. It's slower than the petrol, which they claim 10.5 for the petrol empty. Those are the two variants we've driven, so those are the two numbers they've given me. The petrol does feel a lot quicker, but there is a lot of satisfaction with the low-down grunt in this car. You don't have to rev it too high to extract good performance out of it. You can just lazily drive it along in the lower revs and cruise very effortlessly. And I know a lot of people enjoy that in diesel engines. Now let's talk pricing. This Tata Curvv in its GDI manual top-end trim costs rupees 17.5 lakhs ex-showroom. The diesel that we drove, top-end diesel DCT, cost rupees 19 lakhs ex-showroom. At those prices, it does undercut the Hyundai Creta's corresponding GDI and diesel variants by a little bit. But it should do that because honestly the Curvv feels like something between the Nexon and the Creta rather than a full-blown Creta rival. I say that in terms of the space on the inside, I say that in terms of how big the car feels from the inside, and also its engine spec. This 1.2 GDI is smaller than the Creta GDI. It does make less power than the Creta GDI. So if you are in the market for a mid SUV segment that looks really cool, that is packed to the grill with features and won't break the bank, I think the Curvv should be right on your list. And hey, spoiler alert, I prefer the Curvv with the GDI engine over the Curvv EV. I just think it's a nicer package.